understanding what their goals are and how like we can kind of like jointly achieve is really critical, right? So I think really understanding that before going into review for an exec, and then just generally how do you approach this partner team, right? And understanding, like almost understanding what their constraints are too is really important.
For those who joined in, as a quick reminder, again, my name is Nupur, and we're excited to be here and partnering with Women in Product to bring you the session today. It is all about strategic persuasion and C-suite influencing. And so thank you for attending live today and choosing to spend time with us. Today's event is also a part of Women in Products Blender event. So it's a series to connect the community year-round with targeted networking opportunities and then bite-sized skill building session. The event is obviously in partnership with Google, and we have wonderful Google leaders today. The way this works is after the discussion today with our speakers, we'll open up the stage for Q&A and then head to one-on-ones to discuss. And for the panel discussion, please feel free to ask the questions in the Q&A tab, or I'll read them during the Q&A period. And if you're comfortable, I will also invite you to ask questions in person on stage as well, or virtual stage. All right, with me today is a deeply experienced group, and I'm really excited to announce or introduce Aarti, Sandy, and Stephanie here. I'll be brief and let them tell you, and allow them to tell you a little bit about themselves, and also if they can share some of their favorite movies when they were growing up. And it's a tough. How about
I could start. Yeah. Hey everyone, I'm Sandy Hoang. I've been in product management for over 20 years. And at the 20-year mark, I think I stopped counting. I'll just say over 20 years so that I don't seem as ancient. But I've kind of gone through big enterprise product management to like mid-size. Used to be in payments at PayPal. I was at Oracle. And right before Google, I was at Lending Club. So I've experienced like the enterprise side, the consumer side, and a little bit of the startup life. So I felt well prepared to join Google. Been in product for almost my entire career since I graduated college, and I have just loved every moment of it. I could not imagine myself doing any other job. So thanks for having me and having us today. I'll hand it over to Steph.
Yeah, hi everybody. I'm Stephanie.
Oh, sorry, I forgot about my favorite movie. Sorry.
Yes,
sorry to interrupt.
That's right, Cindy. You thought you were going to get away with that. Go ahead.
My favorite movie was growing up as Gremlins, and it was one of my favorite movies, but it was one of the ones that I could remember. I just loved it because it was just the concept was, as a kid, it's like, oh my gosh, you can't feed them after midnight. And, as a kid, like following rules versus, pushing the boundaries of rules, like that somehow really appealed to me, like breaking rules, but like trying to balance that. And then they were just so freaking cute on the one hand, but then it's crazy scary on the other. So I think it just like that juxtaposition really appealed to me as a kid for some reason. So anyway, now I'll pass it off to Steph.
That's awesome. Hi, everybody. I'm Stephanie Shum. I lead the retail ads consumer experience PM team at Google. I've been here a tenth of the time that Sandy has. So just hit 2.5 years, actually. So maybe a little bit less than that. But yeah, I've been on this team since being at Google. Before that, I was at Facebook for almost 8 years, working on everything from mobile app install ads to games to marketplace as kind of my last stint at Facebook. And before that, I was an engineer and PM at Yahoo. Yahoo's where I learned what a PM was. And like Sandy, I can't really imagine doing any other function, having any other job. Love to build products, love to work with cross-functional teams. And actually, I think today's topic is a really, really good one that I was excited to join and participate in. I think it's like a very critical skill as a PM and kind of like advancing in your career as a PM. So excited to talk about that and share some experiences. Women in Product has a special place in my heart. I was part of the original crew that organized the very first conference when there was like we were like, wow, we have 300 people coming. That's amazing. And now it's, insane. So super happy to connect with this community always and excited to talk about this topic. Aarti?
Thank you. Thank you, Steph. Hey, everyone. I'm Aarti Bharathan, and I lead payments at Google's payments platform. We're essentially the platform that powers all of the monetization products at Google. So essentially cloud ads, YouTube, the Play Store, Google Store, and several others. And I apologize for all of the background noise around here for any fintech enthusiasts. If you're like me, you may be walking the floors of Las Vegas right now. We have Money 2020 going on. So yes, I've been a PM my entire career. I haven't actually coded for a living, as some of my engineering friends would say, and I love every part of it. Before Google, I was at PayPal for several years, and before that, I was at Microsoft. What I've loved at all of these places is I've built a combination of 0 to 1 products, built businesses out, as well as worked on platforms, kind of gone the full circle. And especially when I was building out some of these 0 to 1 products, there were times when things were really existential. And there's just so much to be done to influence so many stakeholders to just make sure you get the 10 engineers that you need for the next quarter so that you can actually keep your commitments. And from there, it really came by that, executive influence or strategic influence is a lot about understanding one's stakeholders. So really excited to be here. Excited to share what I've learned. Also excited to learn from my fellow panelists.
Wonderful. Aarti, we're still waiting on that favorite movie. And then yes. Stephanie, I haven't forgotten about you. We're coming back.
I forgot. So, I think right now the favorite movie that I can recall from when I was a kid was Honey, I Shrunk the Kids. It's like one of the super cheesy movies. I had amazing memories of it. And then I was super scared to actually see it with my own kids. And I did. And I thought, you know what? It's not actually that bad. Like the whole concept and everything that happened is still so cool. So yeah.
Love it. How about you, Stephanie?
I think probably again, I'm afraid of the same thing Sandy was afraid of it. I very distinctly remember really loving the movie Annie because I'm like a musical, like singing, dancing, like all of that. My mom claims I stood up in my chair in the theater and started singing along with Annie. But also I just realized, she was kind of like a, little girl who knew what she wanted, and she was like sassy, and I kind of, I think I admired that from an early age.
That's amazing. And to think she inherited a lot of money as well. Wonderful. This is great. And thank you all for sharing that. On to our topic for today. So I say this having been subjected to this in my career a few times, but I think I can speak for everyone when I say that influencing executives is not an easy task. And then to make it even more hectic or troublesome, there is no one-size-fits-all method to adopt here. So what we want to learn is from our product leaders today around 3 main topics, which is what are some of the more meaningful things that require persuasion? How do you influence stakeholders and bring them along in your product story and decisions? And then how do you present and show up in a high-stakes situation with overall sort of increase your range of techniques for bargaining and persuasion? So to begin, I'm really curious to see the start of all of this, which is what are some of the meaningful things that require persuasion to begin with? And Sandy, I'd love to kick this off with you to hear your response from your career experiences.
Yeah, thanks, Nupur. I kind of want to, as a PM, I mean, one answer is like, what does not require persuasion? I feel like as a PM, we spend most of our job is to persuade other people to do things that they may not want to do or may not have thought of. It's, you know, evangelism is probably like another like more extreme version of that. Is as a PM, you really need to have that resilience to be willing to try to persuade, convince, evangelize the same thing over, like your vision or like your objective, like over and over and over again to like multiple groups of people, right? Pretty much like everywhere you go, whether it's your direct working group, your, you know, your team members, your boss, your boss's boss, like your, you know, the execs. It's, you always like always be selling. Basically, you're always like pushing for your project or that, you know, that high profile thing or like the next big thing, you know, over the next 3 years. So you know, as PMs, we are the ones that set the priorities for our organizations, right? You know, we're kind of like at Google, we're in the middle of annual planning season, right? Annual planning, setting OKRs for the following year. And so this is where like PM skills and PM value really comes into play, right? It's all about doing the day-to-day things, like making sure your eng team has what they need. They're unblocked. You've got, you know, requirements for them. All that is table stakes and a given. But really, where PMs like kind of prove their worth is how do you influence others to do things, to invest in your product, to prioritize it, to invest in your company, right? To keep things afloat, like keep your company alive, like everything from like invest in this small project for the next quarter to like keep my company alive to like let me hire 20 people in the next year. So it's like we're exercising that influencing skill like all the time, pretty much about everything to like everyone. And so, you know, in a way, you kind of have to develop this resilience, right? This like willingness to repeat yourself, to sell to whoever will listen, and you develop this like almost like this thick skin of, yeah, somebody might say no or ignore you or like forget, and the next time you see them, you'll have to like go through the same thing again, and you just like grit your teeth and you go through it again. So you develop this resilience so that you kind of like create this shield around yourself. Just expect that this is what you'll have to do, and you avoid kind of like for your part, avoid fatigue of like, oh gosh, I can't believe I'm like going through this for the 4th time this week to this person, and you, in doing so, hone your message to figure out like, okay, what's landing, what's not landing. Like when I talk to the next person or the next level, like how am I going to hone my message so by the time that I get to the C-suite, it's going to be a much better message, right? So use those opportunities as ways to like refine your message and like refine your pitch essentially. So you know, to me that is something like a mindset that PMs just have to have. Love to hear from, you know, Aarti and Steph as well about like their experience, like maybe something about like, you know, how do you tailor your message to lean on shared objectives, or how do you identify like who, right? Who needs to be influenced, right? It's not always the obvious person. So we'd love to hear from either of you.
Yeah, I can jump in here. I think you kind of nailed it in kind of the last part that you said, Sandy. I mean, that really resonates with me of like, you kind of need to, and being newer to Google, I think being at Google for 20 plus years, you probably know who the right people are to talk to in a lot of cases. But yeah, I think one of the first things to kind of figure out is, you know, who actually influences the person you're trying to persuade, right? Like who do they listen to? Who has their ear? And figuring out who those folks are, and you know, the piece where you actually persuade, all of it happens before you're actually in the review, right? Like it's how much those people who actually influence the person that makes the decision, how invested they feel in your success or, you know, getting the outcome that you want. And so it's really, really critical to understand who actually are the influencers. It's not always who's the most vocal, although a lot of times it is. but you know, finding out like, you know, who does that exec, or who does this partner team that you're trying to influence. It doesn't have to be an exec. It can just be another team that you rely on, you have dependencies on. You need them to do work for you to be successful. How do you identify who those folks are? You have to identify like what motivates them. What are their goals? Like, how do you convince them? And then you want to go, I think the best review I had was we went into this executive review and like the key folks that this exec like relied on, I knew that they would turn to those folks in the meeting and say, hey, has Stephanie reviewed this with you? Or how do you feel about this? Is when I already know they're going to nod their heads and be like, yeah, like we walked through it and, addressed whatever issues. And so that was just a very clarifying moment. This is at Facebook. It took a lot to get there. So it's all that pre-work, but like getting to that review meant kind of like, it's kind of art of war. Everybody comes in, there's no surprises. That's probably the ideal. Not always the case, but that's probably the ideal. Aarti, do you have anything you want to add?
I really agree with you, Steph. That magic moment where everyone comes into the room, and it's not so much that a decision is being asked for or anything. The decision's actually made. This is more of an FYI. We've all agreed upon this, and here's kind of the thinking that we went through, which is really magical. And this is where, when I was very early in my career, I thought strategic influencing meant showing up at that final review and somehow magically convincing everyone, like the way they do it in the movies. And then also realizing that you may not have all of the answers. And very early in my career, you obviously expected that, as an ICPM, I know my area really, really well. And so if I didn't have the answer to a question, it's catastrophic. But as you progress, you actually realize that execs operate in a world where they don't know most of the things. They're operating from a place of curiosity, of asking questions, and of asking people around them. And they make their decision based on the advice and input from everyone around them. And so then that was like a big learning. One was, yes, I don't need to have all of the answers. It's perfectly okay. And that then gives permission to say, okay, I'm actually going to take help from everyone around and work with them. Really, in some ways, kind of make them invested in this idea. And as they sort of brainstorm and work through, we get to a place where when that final presentation happens, it's like everyone's really sold. And the narrative has definitely evolved. It's probably not where it was on day one. And that's actually okay. We've brought people along.
It seems like based on the chat and probably like the Q&A, folks might be eager to learn some tips of like how we approach influencing. So maybe Steph.
Yeah, I think I think probably the most critical thing to understand is, what are people's like, how do they approach problems? Like, what resonates with them, and then what motivates them, right? So like, what are their goals almost, right? So to me, it's motivation is like, are they data driven? Like, if you show up with all the data, all the metrics, all the, is that going to convince them? Or are they like user needs based, right? Or research based, right? If you tell them, hey, like, when we did a study on this, are they, here's some qualitative, insights that we have from user research. Are they extremely design oriented, right? Do they love to look at mocks and like, and co-design, those execs that always like to co-design with you. Fun. So what motivates them? It's really critical to understand, how to, as PMs, one of the most effective things, kind of like skills in our arsenal is how do we story tell? That can be through data, that can be through user insights, that can be through, what's happening in the market. If they care deeply about, a specific competitor, or they compare, they really always reference, insert company name or competitor name, what really motivates them, and then what are their goals, right? Like, and this is actually true, again, not just of executives, but key stakeholders in other orgs who you either rely on or you need to partner with. As a very classic example, I work on retail ads. I have a commerce, shopping, organic counterpart team, right? That, I mean, we have very different goals, right? Of course, a lot of our goals are really centered around revenue, right? And a lot of their goals are based in more user engagement, et cetera, right? So there's always understanding what their goals are and how we can kind of jointly achieve is really critical, right? So I think really understanding that before going into review for an exec, and then just generally how do you approach this partner team, right? And understanding, almost understanding what their constraints are too is really important, right? So for example, I have a partner kind of more platform team that I work with. And more recently, there's been a lot of negotiation, a lot of discussion because, they are resource constrained, for example, right? And so they are looking at every single kind of requests from their partner teams or requesting teams and evaluating and deciding what they should prioritize, right? So I need to understand that A, that they're resource constrained, and B, how are they making their decision on what to prioritize? That's actually really critical. And so once I understand that, then I can go and, kind of make the case, message, or just say, hey, look, based on your decision criteria, we don't meet the bar. So let me go talk to, whatever, my leadership and try to get prioritized another way. But these are really critical and important things to understand before going to try to convince, because we all have our own tendencies, right? I might be more data-driven, Sandy might be more user insights-driven. If I approach her, just keep approaching her with data, and it doesn't really convince her, then that's kind of frustrating on both sides, right? No matter how much resilience you have, right? So really, really understanding that is critical.
Yeah, there's something that we do. I don't know if it's Google wide, but at least in my group, which is customer engagement, and we we're the interface to all Google customers, right? Worldwide, all products, right? We provide help solutions, support solutions for all Google products, and so the scale of that is massive. And so we are pretty careful about what we do, and I'm sure Steph, and ads you are too, right? Because that affects the bottom line. And what we have is what we call a four in a box, right? So we have every major function represented. So at each level, we've got a PM lead, an eng lead, a design lead, and a program manager lead. And sometimes there's an additional UXR research lead too, but the core group is usually that four, and you kind of have to vet things through the four before, sure, there's usually a first amongst equals, right? It's usually the PM or the eng lead, depending on what group you're in and what function, right? If it's more user focused versus tech focused, but you vet things through that, each one of those, so that you kind of make sure you have a good case, right? That there aren't any blind spots. We complement each other really well. So when you're trying to build a case for something, you're okay, I'm the PM who's always going off on the long-term vision and wanting to move fast and do crazy things, hence break rules, maybe, don't feed people or pets after midnight, or do feed them after midnight. And then there's always it's all very stereotypical too. The eng lead is very measured, asks a bunch of questions, tries to understand the problem, and so on, so that we kind of make sure we cover at least all those major bases, so that when we then go try to influence or persuade at the next level or to partners, we've at least covered our own bases. And plus one to Steph about understanding what the partner motivations are, because we tend to be, depending on what industry you're in, tend to be very tech, I think software is probably a safe bet, that we tend to be very software focused. Okay, this is how things work in software product management, right? You have your sprints, you do your requirements, you move fast, you test and learn, do experiments. But if your partner is operations, which my partner sometimes is, then they can't do that, right? They cannot move a 3,000 agent team because you wanted to run an experiment and the agent has no idea what the user saw because they were part of an experiment arm, right? Or you can say like, hey, we can save all this money by like changing the funnel here, right? No more contacts. Like, okay, well, you can't really act on that because we use a combination of FTE and TVC or contractor agents, right? You can't just nullify a contract in the middle of the year. You've got to run that contract out until next year. So these are the factors that you have to think about. Like, oh, okay, I was so engrossed in my own, like just only worried about the software part of things. I, had neglected like the business part of things. So I'd say to Steph's point, like think about the overall business, right? Not just the software building part. And through that, you will probably be able to elicit a lot of your, like generally elicit stakeholder concerns.
Yeah, I so agree with that, Sandy. And I look back at my career, and there have been times when, yeah, maybe built the perfect product. In fact, there was this time at PayPal where I thought that the product was amazing. We had improved our conversion like phenomenally. We went from an onboarding conversion of like 55% to like 86%. We were incredibly happy. But then our CFO was actually very upset because the users that we were bringing in, their cost of acquisition was high, their lifetime value was low, the product was not going to make money, and this is kind of where, as PM, right, understanding which business are we in and who are all of our stakeholders, right? That was a big wake up call for me because up until then I was very focused on I'm going to build the absolute best product. And so then learning from that experience, it became important that it was to build the best product, but for the users of the product, because otherwise we have to think about the users who are not the users of the product. Um, and in that case, there's actually adverse impacts on the business in itself. Um, so that was sort of a huge um, understanding, if I will, that I had, that I have stakeholders beyond the people who I work with on a day-to-day basis. They're actually making decisions that I didn't even know that they were the ones who were maybe making these decisions. Yes, I love that term on guardrail metrics. I didn't know I had to consider revenue positive to be a guardrail metric at that time in my career. Um, and so, from there, it was really thinking about, okay, what kind of then information will this exec need to make that decision? And so then making sure that I then work with the finance team and work with other teams to really get to that place. And from there, it's about how do you then present and kind of show up in that high stake meeting finally, right? There's all of this best practice, if you will, that goes in to prepare now for what is become a fairly high stakes conversation. And so once I realized that, okay, this situation is pretty acute, it meant really kind of peeling the onion, right? Who are these next set of influencers, if you will, right? Who are the people who are thinking about factors beyond just what I was thinking about, and sort of seeking out um, friends or colleagues who knew them, as well as seeking out partners who could help me make that case, if you will. So it was people from finance, people from analytics, strategy, and then you know other leaders that I had to help weave a story together. So those were some things which I kind of saw around. How do I finally take a situation and then present and show up in something really high stakes? would love to hear as well, from Steph and Sandy, right? When you're looking at these high stakes environments, how do you present? How do you think you need to show up?
Yeah, I think you kind of alluded to it, and maybe I alluded to kind of going back to the beginning of what I said. You have to always be selling. Like certainly that exec meeting is that's not the first time that you presented your case, right? And expect like, oh, it's a bulletproof case. Of course they're gonna say yes. It's like you have been honing your skill, practicing on unwitting colleagues and partners and whoever else, right? You've been making this case and vetting it, like not just making the case, but vetting it, refining it with like your own team, with partner teams, and in a large organization. I mean that, and many organizations are consensus driven, like whether you recognize it or not, right? Regardless of the corporate culture, a lot of organizations are consensus driven. So you will need to have made that case to like not only like your partners but multiple levels of partners to make sure that they are going to back you, right? So it's a little bit of like politicking, it's a lot of selling, it's relying, like drawing upon that resilience to be able to do it over and over and over again, and to maybe glean a little bit from each time you do it to help like bolster your case and to make it better. So when you're in that room, that exec is going to be looking to their lieutenant and like to their and maybe like a few levels of lieutenants to see like, do you agree with this, right? So it's not just about perfecting the like your presentation or whatever, like for that moment. It's you have been building up to that moment for possibly weeks or months before you depending on the size of the company, of course. If it's a startup, it's like, okay, one day and it's done. If it's a big company, you've got many weeks of preparation and like convincing multiple levels to even get to that point.
Yeah, I think as much preparation going in definitely helps. As much buy-in ahead of time definitely helps. And understanding little things like, does this executive like actually read pre-reads, right? Like those are really, really important things. So I think going in, being as prepared as possible, getting as much alignment ahead of time as possible. You always have to be prepared also for like, there's always an exec or a stakeholder who might throw a curveball, right? And ask a question that maybe you're not prepared for, right? And so I think the number one mistake I would make all the time, particularly when I was starting to be in exec reviews, is I would be so, I don't know if you guys had this as well, I'd be so nervous and worked up that I would not even be really listening to the question or not reading the room, which I think is actually interesting in this new kind of like remote world, because now it's like everybody's a tile. So you can like, sometimes I literally like just like pin the important people so I can make sure I see them if there's a really big meeting. It's really important to listen to the conversation that's happening. It's really important to really understand the question that the exec is asking, because chances are like this is like your boss's boss or boss's 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 boss. And so you're like, your adrenaline's going and you might not be really paying attention. And to read the room, right? Like read, are people distracted? Are they, not paying attention? Sometimes another pro tip is if I feel like they're distracted, but I really need an answer from them, I will literally call their name and be like, Fred, like, what do you think about, XYZ, or do you have any major concerns, right? So that they're paying attention. And to the point of really listening to the question or comment, I think people in our heads, if they're asking a question and you don't respond right away, this silence that is while you're trying to process your answer can feel very deafening and feel like forever. One thing I recommend also is parroting back the question and just saying, okay, what I'm hearing your question is, I think, right, is, and then like repeating it back, because a lot of times you'll get it wrong or you won't get it wrong, but it will need some tweaking. And also, when they are asking a question, is to really try to understand, again, the motivation. Why are they asking? Are they asking because, they're super resource constrained, or they're really asking because, oh, we're just short of our revenue goals, or they're asking because this other person who has their ear is probably like, not agreeing with it for whatever reason, right? And just to like call it out and say, hey, I understand your concern. You might be concerned about XYZ. Here's how we think about it, right? These are all really, really important kind of techniques to make sure that you are grounding the conversation and that your answers are really, really answering the question that's being asked. It's kind of, I think of it as like the opposite. If anybody's taken like PR training, it's exactly the opposite, right? Where PR training, all you're trained to do is like, just keep honing in on the same message, no matter what question they ask you, right? You want to hit home your message and you just like answer with the same type of thing. This is totally different, right? Where you really want to understand the motivation and the true question that's being asked so that you can either answer or call upon somebody else to answer, or literally say, I don't actually know the answer. Let me get back to you on that. I think why you're asking it is because you're concerned about XYZ. Am I right? Right. So these are all kind of like acceptable things. But yeah. Any other tips that you, Sandy or Aarti, have in these like high stakes reviews?
Wow. I think, Steph, I loved your point, right? Where you were like, wow, you're going to have all of this noise in your head and noise around you and being able to focus. And I think the thing that's really worked in my case has been actually brainstorming with some of these close friends around what could be the curveball questions, right? And then having like a really like a rude Q&A prepared as a memo that many of us share. And then yes, curveballs still happen, but we have something, to your point about being prepared and even more prepared.
I'll just add, like, there's always one person who's always complaining, right? So like seek out that person and like run it by them to see what their objections are. So I think you might cover like quite a bit of ground from just like make that person your friend, right?
Yeah, this is so true, Sandy. This is literally, speaking of like, to lean on storytelling. I had to go to an exec review, and there was one person on this execs team. This is not Google. This execs team, who was always like the person that would just be like, shooting darts, asking the questions, like, making it very, very difficult. I scheduled time, and I remember I was in Europe, so it was like 10 o'clock at night on a Friday. I was like very determined to get this person's feedback and be able to say, this person like went through it and like no concerns, right? So this person, like, I just was just so determined. And so like at 10 o'clock at night on a Friday night, I called this person. They didn't really know why I was scheduled this meeting with them, but I went through the whole thing and just like, I was like, I have to get this person's buy-in, or their eyeballs have to have touched this deck before we walked in. Definitely, it turned out well, but I mean, that was, sometimes you got to, you're a PM, you got to do what you got to do to get it done. Selena, I agree with you. If you do it in a friendly, she's saying calling out a person's name can feel intimidating, but like, it's not even just like, hey, are you paying attention? It's, hey, would love to hear, and maybe you give them a little time. Would love to hear Fed's feedback on this specifically, since, in his, this team is, critical to, just so that you give them a little bit of time, but like, just make sure that they're in for the for the review. And don't be nervous.
Yeah. I would say that, a lot of these execs operate from a place of impartial information. Right? And we actually have more information than they do. So that's knowledge is power.
Great.
Yeah.
I have one coming in from here, but also to continue our theme. Aarti, what do you think? Maybe, and because I know we come from various industries and companies, but just your sort of perspective on some Google standard expectation or practices that has worked for you, to exec decision makers, or even something like, when are some of the tools that you've used that have become very handy? Like, I know some companies are very focused on having like slides ready before the meeting. Some people are very like, here's the crew data, we're all about the discussion. Some people have memos written. Like, what has worked for you in the past, and then for everyone else as well?
Yeah, I think it depends on a variety of things. But I do this monthly review between myself and um, the person that runs the play business, and so our orgs. And so that's a fairly formal discussion. And so leading up to that, we actually have a monthly business review between our teams, right? So it's very operational, and it's a good way to suss out problems and to share things going well and not, and it gives both teams like a good place to like air out points that they want to, as well as it's sequenced a little bit in advance of this exec review, so that if there are things that need to be escalated or kind of FYI'd in advance, there's time, right? So there's time for the next level of leaders to actually act on it before it gets to the top set of leaders. And then really getting into that review prior to that, if there are red flags that we need to flag, or get other people into meetings. And those meetings actually are very conversational. They may use materials that have been prepared, but they're more conversational because they're actually about solving escalations and solving problems, and to de-escalate really before it gets to that super formal meeting. By the time we get to the really formal monthly meeting, we have a really great deck that goes out. It's every Monday. It's every 4 weeks, Monday, 1 p.m. So the deck usually goes out Friday. And we have like a memo that's prepared with hard questions, or any talking points, or some key things that have come up. And usually the conversation that happens in the exec review is it's a lot of hot topics. It's not a lot of the operational work. It's assumed that by then the operational things are in place, right? And so that conversation is really about, okay, what's going on in the industry, or what's something really that's burning that we may need to talk about, or if we need to reprioritize. Here's something really important that's come up, and we may need to think about resources. So it's almost like it's an entire engagement, but depending upon the audience and depending upon what we're trying to do, even though these are different levels of execs, we sort of tune it, and that's what I've seen work.
Great tips. Stephanie, Sandy, do you have anything to add? It's okay. I think Aarti covered a whole lot for us.
Yeah, I think she did a great job covering that.
Perfect. Actually, we're towards the end of our session, and I do want to save 10 minutes of our time to go over all the wonderful Q&As we're getting here in the tab. I know there is a little bit of somewhat of an upvoting feature. Please feel free to use that as well. That gives us an indication of where a majority of you want to hear. But let me kick off with a few. Allison asked, can you share experiences of making wrong decisions, and how did you roll back? We've all been there. Allison.
I mean, all the time. Maybe not all the time. I mean, at this point, as PMs, I think we are often like we are the ones that make the decision, right? There are, like, regardless of your level or how big or small your group or your company is. Usually people are looking to the PM to make the decision, right? Because you're setting the priorities, you're leading the team. The PM is the de facto leader of the team, right? And of course, there's the cliche of like the CEO, mini CEO of your product. You have to make decisions. We have to make decisions sometimes with imperfect data, like incomplete or imperfect data, and you kind of make the best decision that you can at that point in time, right? And be willing to adjust and change course. Maybe the decision is not as black and white as a wrong decision, and maybe not the best decision as you learn more information. At least that's that's the spin, right? It's not even spin. It's like, okay, that was the best decision we had at the time. And now that we've tried a few experiments, or moved along the roadmap, or gotten additional information, gotten feedback from other teams, or whatever, we need to change course. Do we ever have to like totally reverse course? Sometimes, yeah, that can happen too. And the first thing is like, like, do not expect to make perfect decisions every time, right? Don't hold ourselves to that standard. Like, don't hold anybody to that standard. Just acknowledge that we're making the best decision that we can given the data that we have. And don't be afraid to call it out early if you think something needs to be changed, right? Don't get so like stuck on a project, or get sucked in by like the sunk cost fallacy that, hey, we've come this far, we have to keep going, we have to at least like see it through. Like, sometimes you just gotta let it go and like change course. So I think that is the difficult part, is being able to recognize it and then call it, and then guide your team to change course when that happens.
Yeah, I love that. I want to reemphasize, like, I think we were alluding to this, Sandy, which is just like, own it. Like, if you've made a mistake, a wrong decision, a mistake, whatever it is, I think, no one, like Sandy said, no one's going to make perfect decisions. And so really owning it and just saying, hey, it seems like we made the wrong decision here. It might have been the best decision we could make at the time with the information that we had, but like, own it and really reflect on, what could have gone better, like what might have changed that, and move forward. And I actually have almost like a twofer. I think there was a question around like influencing people in a different org. I actually had very recently a situation where I had to go to another leader in a kind of like a partner team and say, hey, neither of us really showed up well in that review, right? Like, I was just very like straightforward. Neither of us showed up really well. We were not fighting, but like disagreeing and clearly not aligned in front of an exec. And although the outcome of that meeting, it went fine, like that exec made the decision, we kind of put them in a bad situation because, it's not like we co-escalated in a like very productive way, which I think is another question. Maybe it's a threefer, which is like, escalation is not a bad thing if you do it together and just go in and say, hey, look, we have very different goals. Or we have very different things that we want to get done, and we're unable. Can you help us break this tie, right? And here's why this is, we're escalating. So I went to this other leader and I said, I don't think we showed up well. And I don't want, going forward, us to kind of operate in this way where we're thrashing the teams, et cetera. Like, tell me, how we can do better, and what are the concerns that you have? And this was digging into their motivation. This person turns out says, look, I'm super resource constrained. And I only have like so many folks that I can dedicate to these like partner requests. It's kind of the same team, partner requests, right? And so, if your request doesn't like fit, kind of the goals that I have, it's really hard for me to prioritize. And so I was like, okay, great. This is like really, really eye-opening for me. And we kind of agreed, okay, like, here's how we should proceed going forward, or here's how we make a better decision going forward. And, I guess the verdict is out on whether or not it'll work. But I think starting with the owning it and being like vulnerable, especially if you're like just not in agreement with another org or another person that where you just have conflicting goals, and just saying, hey, like, how can we break this tie? How can we solve this problem? I think is critical, just to make sure, again, you're not going to make perfect decisions or have perfect relationships with everybody. So I think, Aarti, do you have anything to add to that?
I will say this, that I had to learn over time that it's actually okay to own your mistakes. And I learned from a leader who launched a product we launched a feature, and people just didn't like it. And like the user research, like the coming in the early days was like, yeah, it's mixed, blah blah. But they're like, yeah, let's just go ahead with it. And then they were perfectly okay turning around and saying, oh, you know what? I made a mistake. That call, we're going to change it. And when I saw them do that, I sort of took a leaf out of their book and I said, okay, I can actually go ahead and do it. Because at least one of the things I've been guilty of is just overanalyzing and trying to make sure that everything is in place, right? And the learning from this effort was that it's actually okay to go ahead, make a decision, right? Make sure that there is, if it's a big enough decision, that there is enough buy-in. That here's why a decision is being made. That there are pros and cons and trade-offs, and we're still making it. And if it doesn't work out, um, I feel like nothing is that terribly bad. Yes, I've had to shut down products sometimes, right? Or be part of products that have been shut down. And there are still learnings from them. Uh, and we're all here to live another day.
Wise words to live by. I agree. I have one more question that's getting a lot of votes here, which is what is the one important advice you would give when trying to influence senior leaders who are in CrossR, so not in our org? What works and what doesn't work when dealing with them, especially non-product teams such as sales and operations?
I think this really goes back to like what are their goals and what motivates them, right? Like sales. So let's just take sales as an example. And it turns out they have very different goals than we do, right? They have specific adoption goals to drive or accounts that they manage, et cetera. So I think understanding what is motivating them. And I would say a lot of times people get the like false impression that product teams they own it, they drive everything. And I think a lot of times with non-product teams, it's all about, again, really understanding and hearing like their concerns, right? And it's not that we might solve all of their problems, but at the very least, like making sure that they feel heard and that we are surfacing and addressing some of their largest problem, their biggest pain points, right? Because for example, for sales on ads, like they are the people that interface with our advertisers. They are critical to the success of our products. And so, understanding from them, what their key pain points are day to day, what they're hearing, there are eyes in our ears to advertisers, which is really, really important. And so making sure, giving them the platform and the forum to, whether it's like a quarterly business review or whatever it is, like they are the voice, right? To the voice of the advertiser. So it's actually very critical that we understand, what they deal with on a day-to-day basis, because it affects our business and the success of our products. And again, understanding their motivation, how are they evaluated, right? That's all really, really critical, because like I said, their goals are different from ours, right?
Yeah. I would say that in many ways, our partner teams in sales and operations, customer support, and so on, tend to be a lot more resource constrained than we are in PM, and it's something that one appreciates when we listen to even how their reward structures are set up, or they actually may get compensated based on the success of these rollouts and their adoptions or revenues, right? Um, Typically, PM and we're not in that environment where we have a little more of space to try to take risks and fail and so on. So I think sort of understanding that really helps, and showing that empathy and kind of showing up, knowing where they're coming from. Uh, I think that goes a really long way. And then, yes, saying, okay, here is the goal that we have in mind, and what does it mean, right? What roadblocks might be there? And, welcome their opinions. They'll probably have the 20 ways it can go wrong. Um, and so that would be a great way to actually build connection and trust with them.
That's a really good point. Thank you, Aarti, for your insight here as well. I know empathy with partner teams go a really long way in building that allyship as well before you even step into a meeting or an executive decision. So I want to be respectful of everyone's time, particularly our speakers. I know they have a lot of commitment. I think Aarti has to catch a flight as well, which is going to be really interesting. But I really wanted to thank them for all their insights and learnings that they have shared with us from their careers, but also thank the attendees for actually attending this live today and asking wonderful questions as well. I don't want to take the time away from your one-on-one Blender sessions as well, but before I let you all go on to the next thing, there's some very powerful takeaways in this chat as well, which is, ranging from developing a thick skin from someone who will say no to you and maybe repeatedly say no to you, to kind of developing resilience for yourself and shielding yourself and protecting yourself. But then also just the highlight of, everything is part of storytelling. If you tell a good story, people buy that story really well. They want to be part of that product journey. And then just understanding, even before you step into the meeting, can you have consensus with your partner teams, even, just to make sure that you guys are not disputing a lot of disagreements in the meeting itself. And I know personally for me, that has helped a lot in executive decisions where, you have sort of a united front with some of your key allies here and stakeholders. And most of all, owning your mistakes is never a bad thing. We've all learned this from our career. I think transparency is a huge win for everyone. And frankly, everyone makes mistakes. And so we can all learn from it.